The sweat on Carlos's palm made his service weapon feel slippery as he maintained his aim at the two men flanking Diego. The legendary footballer sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still wearing his tracksuit from training, his dark eyes moving between the gun at his temple and Carlos in the doorway. "You have 30 seconds, the taller Colombian said, his accent thick as motor oil. A thin scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "Answer the question." Diego's breathing remained steady, almost meditative. Carlos had seen this before, the same unnatural calm Diego displayed before taking a crucial penalty kick. The room smelled of expensive cologne and something else, fear, not from Diego, but from Carlos himself. The second Colombian stockier with gold teeth that caught the lamplight pressed his revolver harder against Diego's temple. "We know about the debts. We know about the cocaine. We know about the photographs." Carlos's radio crackled softly on his belt, his backup team checking in from the lobby. If he called for help now, the situation would escalate into a bloodbath. If he didn't, Diego Maradona, Argentina's golden god, might die in this gilded hotel room while Carlos watched. "The question is simple," Scarface continued. "Will you work with us, or do we make an example that reaches every footballer from here to Mexico City?" That's when Diego smiled. Not the practiced grin he flashed for cameras, but something darker, something that made the Colombian with the gold teeth shift uncomfortably. "Ustedes no saben con quién están hablando." Diego's voice carried the authority of a man who had bent the world to his will with nothing but a leather ball and raw talent. "You don't know who you're talking to." The words hung in the air like a blade. Carlos felt the shift immediately, the subtle change in the Colombians' posture, the way their certainty flickered for just an instant. But it wasn't fear that changed everything. It was what Diego said next, 6 words that Carlos would replay in his mind for the next 30 years. 6 words that would haunt him long after he'd hung up his government badge and tried to disappear into the anonymous streets of Buenos Aires. 6 words that revealed Diego Maradona understood exactly who these men were and who had sent them. The Colombians lowered their weapons. Not slowly, not reluctantly, but immediately, as if Diego had just spoken a magic incantation that drained all the threat from the room. Gold Teeth stepped back from the bed, his face pale beneath his tan. Scarface holstered his pistol and nodded once, not to Diego, but to Carlos. That's when Carlos realized the horrible truth. This wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't even a threat. It was a job interview. And somehow, impossibly, Diego had just given the correct answer to a question Carlos hadn't even heard asked. The Colombians filed past him toward the door, and Scarface paused just long enough to press a thick envelope into Carlos's hand. "Pleasure doing business," he murmured, then disappeared into the hallway with his partner. Carlos stood frozen, the envelope burning in his palm like a live coal. Inside the room, Diego had already moved to the window, gazing out at the Buenos Aires skyline as if nothing had happened. "Sir?" Carlos's voice came out as a croak. "Close the door, Carlos." He obeyed, his hands shaking as he turned the deadbolt. When he faced the room again, Diego was looking directly at him, and Carlos saw something in those famous eyes he'd never seen before. Disappointment. "You thought they came here to threaten me?" It wasn't a question. Carlos nodded, not trusting his voice. "They came here to pay me." Diego gestured at the envelope. "And now they've paid you too." The weight of the envelope seemed to multiply in Carlos's hand. He wanted to throw it down, to protest that he hadn't known, hadn't agreed to anything. But the words died in his throat because Diego was still looking at him with that terrible understanding. "This changes everything between us," Diego said quietly. "You know that, right?" Carlos did know. In the span of 5 minutes, he'd gone from protector to accomplice, from trusted guardian to potential liability. The man he'd sworn to keep safe had just revealed himself as something far more dangerous than Carlos had ever imagined. "What were the 6 words?" Carlos whispered. Diego's smile returned, but this time it was sad, almost pitying. "Ask me in 30 years, Carlos, when you're old enough to understand what they really meant." That was the last conversation they ever had as bodyguard and client. Within a week, Carlos had submitted his resignation from government service, Within a month, he'd disappeared into civilian life, using the money from that envelope to start over, and for 30 years, he told himself he'd gotten away with it. Until this morning, when the photographs arrived at his security office, and Carlos Mendoza realized that some secrets never stay buried. They just wait for the right moment to destroy everything you've built since. Want to know what happens when Carlos faces his past? Hit that follow button because Chapter 2 drops tomorrow, and you won't believe who's been watching him all these years. The photographs lay scattered across Carlos's desk like accusations made flesh. Black and white, grainy but unmistakable. Him in that hotel room 30 years ago accepting the envelope. Diego by the window, the Colombian's faces partially visible as they departed. Carlos pushed back from his desk, the wheels of his chair scraping against the worn linoleum of his small office. Through the single window, Buenos Aires hummed with its usual chaos. Car horns, distant music, the perpetual symphony of a city that never quite settled into silence. But inside this cramped room above a pharmacy on Avenida Corrientes, time felt suspended. He'd built this life carefully, deliberately. Mendoza Security Solutions occupied 2 modest rooms and employed exactly 3 people: himself, his secretary Rosa, who came in twice a week, and Miguel, a former cop who handled the overnight shifts at the warehouses they protected. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention from the kind of people who sent photographs without return addresses. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, a skin of milk forming on the surface. His hands, once steady enough to thread a rifle sight in the rain, now trembled as he reached for his phone. Maria would be in court right now, prosecuting another money laundering case for the federal attorney's office. His daughter, the prosecutor who'd made it her mission to hunt the very monsters who'd sent these photographs. The irony wasn't lost on him. Carlos stood and walked to the small mirror hanging beside his filing cabinet. At 58, he looked older. Gray had claimed most of his hair, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights over the past 3 decades. But his shoulders were still broad. His stance still carried the echo of military discipline. Some habits never died, even when you wish they would. The afternoon light filtering through his window held that golden quality unique to Buenos Aires autumns. Maria would be finishing her closing arguments soon. She always called him after big cases, excited to share the details of legal maneuvers he barely understood but listened to anyway, because her voice carried joy when she talked about justice. Justice. The word tasted bitter now. He returned to his desk and picked up the note that had accompanied the photographs. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. Meet me tonight. La Biela Café, Recoleta. 9 p.m. Come alone, or she learns what kind of man really raised her. No signature, no demand for money. Just that promise of revelation that would destroy the one thing Carlos had managed to protect all these years, Maria's faith in him. She'd been 8 when he'd resigned from government service, too young to question why Papa suddenly worked different hours and why they'd moved to a smaller apartment. He told her he wanted a quieter life, something closer to normal. She'd accepted it with the trust that only children possess, the same trust she'd maintained even as she grew into a woman who dedicated her life to exposing corruption. The wall behind his desk held exactly 3 photographs: Maria at her law school graduation, beaming in her cap and gown; Maria at her first communion, gap-toothed and serious; and Maria last Christmas, laughing at something Miguel had said during their small office celebration, red wine staining her lips, completely unguarded in the way she only allowed herself to be around people she considered family. Carlos traced the edge of that last photograph with his finger. In it, Maria wore the silver cross necklace that had belonged to her mother, his Elena, dead now 15 years from cancer. Elena, who'd known something had changed in him after that night with Diego but had never pressed for details. Elena, who'd taken his secret to her grave, trusting that whatever he'd done for them. The phone rang, jolting him from his reverie. Rosa's voice, efficient as always. Carlos? Your 3 o'clock appointment is here. The restaurant owner from Palermo? Send him up. Normal life, normal problems. A restaurant owner worried about break-ins needed security cameras installed. Simple, clean. No envelopes filled with blood money. No legendary footballers revealing themselves as something darker than their public image suggested. But as Carlos straightened his tie and prepared to discuss camera angles and monitoring systems, he couldn't shake the feeling that these photographs represented more than blackmail. Someone had waited 30 years to surface with this evidence. Someone had watched him build this quiet life, had seen him raise Maria, had observed him grow comfortable in his new identity. Someone who understood that the cruelest revenge wasn't destroying a man immediately. It was letting him believe he was safe first. The restaurant owner knocked on his door, and Carlos forced his professional smile into place. But even as he discussed security solutions and payment schedules, part of his mind remained fixed on tonight, on La Biela Cafe and whoever had been patient enough to wait 3 decades for this moment. Outside his window, Buenos Aires continued its eternal dance, unaware that one of its citizens was about to confront the ghosts he'd spent half a lifetime trying to bury. The restaurant owner, a nervous man named Hernandez who kept adjusting his glasses, had barely settled into the chair across from Carlos's desk when the second envelope arrived. Rosa's knock interrupted Hernandez mid-sentence as he explained his concerns about weekend break-ins. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Carlos, but a courier just delivered this. He said it was urgent." The envelope was identical to the morning's delivery. Same cream-colored paper, same absence of return address. But this one was thicker, heavier. Carlos accepted it with steady hands while his stomach dropped into free fall. "Should I reschedule, Mr. Hernandez?" Rosa asked, her maternal instincts picking up on the tension that had suddenly filled the small office. "No." Carlos forced normalcy into his voice. "Give us 10 minutes to finish up." But Hernandez was already gathering his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the atmosphere. "Actually, I can come back tomorrow. This security matter isn't so urgent that—" "Thursday morning," Carlos said, standing to shake the man's hand. 10 o'clock. After they left, Carlos locked his office door and turned the envelope over in his hands. The weight of it suggested more photographs, but when he tore it open, he found something worse. Documents, photocopied but clear enough to read every devastating detail. Bank records showing deposits that coincided exactly with his government salary, except the amounts were triple what any intelligence officer earned. Wire transfers from shell companies with addresses in Medellin and Cali, purchase records for the apartment where he'd raised Maria, paid in cash 2 weeks after that night in the hotel room. And beneath it all, a single photograph that made his blood freeze. Maria, yesterday, walking out of the federal courthouse in her Navy prosecutor's suit, briefcase in hand, completely unaware that someone was close enough to capture every detail of her face. The timestamp showed 5:47 p.m., exactly when she would have been leaving after her latest cartel prosecution. A new note, in the same elegant handwriting: "30 years is long enough, Carlos. Tonight we discuss the debt that compound interest has made. Substantial. Your daughter's work makes her a natural target for the families you helped destroy. It would be unfortunate if they learned where to find her." Carlos sank into his chair as the full scope of his situation crystallized. This wasn't just about that night with Diego. Someone had documented his entire life since then, had tracked every decision, every dollar, every moment of the happiness he'd stolen from his betrayal. The photographs weren't just evidence, they were a portfolio, a comprehensive file on Carlos Mendoza and everything he'd built on a foundation of corruption. His phone buzzed. A text message from Maria: "Won the Vasquez case. 3 counts money laundering, 5 years minimum. Celebrating with the team tonight, but wanted you to be the first to know. Love you, Papa." The casual affection in those words, "Papa," hit him like a physical blow. She still called him that sometimes, a remnant from childhood that had survived her transformation into one of Buenos Aires's most respected prosecutors. A woman who dedicated her career to hunting men exactly like the one her father had become that night in 1994. Carlos stared at the photograph of his daughter leaving the courthouse. Someone had stood close enough to touch her, close enough to harm her, and she'd walked past completely unaware. How many times had this happened? How long had they been watching her, cataloging her routines, her vulnerabilities? He thought of Elena, dying slowly in their small bedroom while Maria held her hand, and Carlos pretended he'd earned the money that paid for her treatments. He thought of Maria's law school graduation, how proud she'd looked, how she'd thanked him for sacrificing his government career to give her a better life. every moment of joy, every achievement, every expression of love, all of it built on a lie that was finally coming due. The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across his office. In 3 hours, he would walk into La Biela Café and face whatever consequences his choices had set in motion. But first, he needed to understand exactly what those choices had cost. Carlos opened his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in 15 years. Elena's medical records, the expensive treatments, the private specialists, the medications that had given them 6 extra months together before the cancer finally won. All paid for with money that had passed through Colombian hands before finding its way into his account. Blood money that had bought love, corruption that had funded hope, betrayal that had financed the only genuine happiness he'd ever known. The weight of that contradiction had been eating at him for 3 decades, and now someone was offering to end his torment. All he had to do was show up and face the reckoning he'd been running from since the day he'd accepted that first envelope. Outside his window, Buenos Aires prepared for another night, unaware that in a small office above a pharmacy, a man was finally accepting that his past had found him. The folder containing Elena's medical records felt heavier than it should have, as Carlos closed it and returned it to the filing cabinet. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting intermittent shadows across the photographs and documents scattered on his desk. He could leave, walk away from all of this, disappear into the Buenos Aires night, and never look back. But they had Maria's photograph. Carlos gathered the evidence of his sins and locked everything in his desk drawer. Normal evening routine, normal preparations for going home. Except tonight, home meant confronting 30 years of carefully constructed lies, and the meeting at La Biela promised to tear down everything he'd built. The pharmacy below was preparing to close when Carlos descended the narrow stairs. Señor Gutierrez looked up from counting register receipts, his weathered face creasing into a smile that Carlos couldn't return tonight. "Working late again, Carlos? You should find a nice woman, settle down properly. Maria's old enough now, she doesn't need—" "Good night, Gutierrez." The old pharmacist's expression shifted at Carlos's tone, but he simply nodded and returned to his counting. Another relationship that would become collateral damage when the truth surfaced. Gutierrez had been kind to them over the years, had even given Maria summer work during high school. Good people who'd accepted Carlos Mendoza as just another middle-aged security consultant trying to make an honest living. Honest. The word followed him onto the sidewalk like an accusation. Avenida Corrientes pulsed with its usual evening energy. Office workers heading home, couples meeting for dinner, tourists consulting maps with the concentrated determination of people trying to experience an entire city in 3 days. Carlos walked among them, but the normalcy felt like theater now. Everyone else was living genuine lives while he played a role he'd perfected over 3 decades. His phone rang as he waited for the bus. Miguel's name on the display. "Carlos, we have a problem at the Morales warehouse. The alarm system is acting up again, and the night manager is nervous about leaving the building unsecured. Can you handle it yourself?" The words came out sharper than intended. Miguel had been with him for 8 years, had become something close to a friend. Another innocent relationship about to become complicated. "You okay, boss? You sound—" "Just handle it, Miguel. I have something I need to take care of tonight." Silence on the other end. Miguel was former police, trained to read voices, to detect when situations were more dangerous than they appeared. "Carlos, if there's trouble—" "Good night, Miguel." Carlos ended the call and immediately regretted his tone. Miguel would worry now, might even drive by Carlos's apartment later to check on him, might ask questions that Carlos couldn't answer without dragging another good man into this mess. The bus ride to Recoleta passed in a blur of familiar neighborhoods that suddenly felt foreign. Every passenger became a potential threat. Every glance in his direction sparked paranoia that had been dormant for 30 years. His old training was surfacing, the hyper-awareness that had kept him alive during his government service, the ability to catalog exits and identify weapons and assess dangers that civilian Carlos Mendoza had deliberately forgotten. But those skills felt rusty now, inadequate for whatever was waiting at La Biela Café. He got off 2 stops early, needing the walk to clear his head. The evening air carried the scent of grilled meat from restaurant patios and the faint sweetness of jacaranda trees. Maria had loved those purple blossoms as a child, had made him stop during their walk so she could collect the fallen petals, simple memories that now carried the weight of stolen time, purchased with blood money. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Maria. Papa tried calling but got voicemail. The celebration is at Puerto Madero if you want to join us. Team would love to meet the man who raised their favorite prosecutor. Carlos stopped walking. Around him, Recoleta's elegant streets continued their evening rhythm, but he felt suddenly disconnected from everything. The couples sharing wine at sidewalk cafes, the families walking dogs, the teenagers arguing passionately about football. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that in 30 minutes, someone's world was about to collapse. He typed and deleted 3 responses to Maria's text. What did you say to someone who was about to lose everything she believed about the person she loved most? How did you prepare for the moment when your daughter discovered that her father's love had been financed by the very criminals she'd spent her career fighting? La Biela came into view, its familiar awning and outdoor tables exactly as he remembered from the rare occasions when he and Elena had splurged on expensive coffee. A lifetime ago, when his secrets still felt manageable, when he'd believed time might eventually soften their edges. Carlos checked his watch, 8:47 p.m. 13 minutes to discover who had been patient enough to wait 3 decades for revenge, and what price they intended to extract for his betrayal. The cafe's warm lights spilled onto the sidewalk, and Carlos realized with growing dread that he was about to face the one person he'd never expected to see again. Carlos hesitated at the edge of La Biela's outdoor seating area, scanning faces that belonged to strangers living uncomplicated lives. A young couple shared dessert at a corner table, laughing at some private joke. An elderly man read a newspaper while his coffee grew cold, completely absorbed in headlines that would be forgotten by tomorrow. Normal people in a normal cafe, unaware that their peaceful evening was about to become the backdrop for 30 years of reckoning. Then, he saw him. The man sat alone at a table near the back, positioned where he could watch the entire cafe while keeping his back to the wall. Mid-30s, with the kind of careful posture that suggested military training. His dark hair was cut short, professional, and when he looked up from his phone, Carlos felt the breath leave his lungs. The eyes, Diego's eyes, unmistakable even in a face that was leaner, harder than the footballer's had been. The same intensity that had made Maradona impossible to ignore on any field, but filtered through decades of something colder, something patient. The man raised his hand in a small gesture, not quite a wave, more of an acknowledgement, and Carlos found himself walking forward on unsteady legs. Each step felt like moving through water, time stretching and compressing until he was standing beside a table where his past had finally taken human form. "Sit down, Carlos." The voice carried a slight accent, Colombian, perhaps smoothed by years of careful cultivation. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Who are you?" Carlos remained standing, though his legs felt unreliable. Around them, the cafe's evening bustle continued, servers weaving between tables, the espresso machine hissing, fragments of conversation in Spanish and English and Italian, creating a backdrop of normalcy that felt increasingly surreal. "My name is Santiago Morales, though for most of my life, I believed it was Santiago Herrera." The man gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please. We have much to discuss, and I'd rather not do it with you looming over me like some disappointed father." The word father landed like a physical blow. Carlos sank into the chair, his hands automatically reaching for the table's edge to steady himself. "You're Diego's son." "Yes." Santiago signaled the waiter with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Café cortado for my friend here. He looks like he needs the caffeine." The waiter nodded and disappeared, leaving Carlos alone with the living proof of consequences he'd never considered. He stared at Santiago's face, seeing Diego in the line of the jaw, the way his fingers drummed against the table, the restless energy that seemed barely contained even in stillness. "He never knew about you." The words escaped before Carlos could stop them. Santiago's expression shifted, revealing something raw beneath the careful composure. "No, he never knew. Thanks to you." The accusation hung between them like smoke, thickening the air until Carlos felt like he was suffocating. I don't understand. What does that night in the hotel have to do with everything? Santiago leaned forward, and Carlos saw 3 decades of accumulated rage flash across his face before being carefully controlled. Do you remember what Diego said to those men? His 6-word answer that supposedly changed everything? Carlos's mouth went dry. Of course he remembered. Those words had haunted him for 30 years, had shaped every decision he'd made since that night. But hearing them referenced by this stranger, this son, made them feel dangerous again, loaded with implications he'd never fully understood. You were there, Carlos said carefully. You were watching. I was 12 years old, hiding in the hotel corridor while my mother tried to work up the courage to knock on Diego's door. Santiago's voice remained steady, but his knuckles had gone white where he gripped his coffee cup. She'd brought me to Buenos Aires to meet him. 3 years she'd been writing letters, trying to reach him through agents and teammates and anyone who might carry a message. Finally, she'd gotten word that he was staying at the Alvear Palace, alone for once. The waiter returned with Carlos's cortado, but the coffee might as well have been poison for all the appeal it held. Carlos forced himself to take a sip, buying time to process what Santiago was telling him. A 12-year-old boy in a hotel corridor, a mother gathering courage for an impossible conversation. The elevator, Santiago continued, was taking forever, so we took the stairs. Mama kept stopping, checking her makeup, rehearsing what she would say. This is your son, Diego. This is Santiago. She'd practiced it 100 times on the flight from Medellin. Carlos felt the first cold fingers of understanding creep up his spine. You saw them arrive, the cartel men. I saw you arrive first. Santiago's eyes never left Carlos's face. You and 2 other men in suits, moving like security, checking the hallway. Then the Colombians. Then the shooting started, and suddenly the corridor was full of people running and screaming. And my mother... Santiago stopped, took a careful breath, reassembled his composure like putting on armor. My mother grabbed my hand and pulled me into the stairwell. We waited there for 2 hours while the police came and went. By the time the hotel was quiet again, Diego was gone. Transferred to a private clinic, surrounded by bodyguards, unreachable. Carlos set down his cup with trembling hands. And your mother? Died 4 years later. Cancer. Spent her last months telling me stories about the greatest footballer who ever lived, and how someday I would meet him and everything would be different. Santiago's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. She never stopped believing that somehow, eventually, she would find a way to reach him. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so terrible that Carlos wanted to stand up and walk away, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But Santiago wasn't finished. Do you want to know what I've spent the last 20 years doing, Carlos? Learning everything about that night. Every detail, every player, every decision that kept me from meeting my father before he died. Carlos felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to collapse. What do you want from me? Santiago reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope, placing it carefully on the table between them. I want you to tell me exactly what Diego said when they put that gun to his head. And then I want you to explain how your choices that night stole the only family I ever had a chance to know. Carlos stared at the envelope on the table, its manila surface worn at the edges as if it had been handled countless times. The sounds of La Biela, clinking cups, murmured conversations, the distant hum of evening traffic, seemed to fade until only Santiago's voice remained. Open it, Santiago said quietly. Inside were documents Carlos recognized immediately. Flight manifests, hotel registrations, medical records, and at the bottom, a photograph that made his blood turn to ice. A 12-year-old boy sitting in a hospital waiting room, his face streaked with tears, while a woman in a faded dress held his hand. That's my mother in the emergency room, Santiago said, his voice carefully controlled. After she collapsed in that stairwell. The stress, the disappointment, it triggered her first heart episode. The beginning of the end. Carlos forced himself to look at the photograph. The woman was beautiful despite her obvious distress, with Diego's same dark eyes and the kind of gentle face that belonged to someone who still believed the world might be kind if she just tried hard enough. She never told you his real name, did she? Carlos asked, though he already knew the answer. Isabella Morales. She was a teacher in Medellin, met Diego during a charity match in 1981, when he was still young and hungry and not yet the god he would become. Santiago's fingers traced the edge of his coffee cup. One night together. That's all it was for him. But for her, it changed everything. She wrote him letters for 12 years, told him about me, about school, about how I played football in the streets and dreamed of being like my father. She sent photographs, my first communion, my school graduations, me holding trophies from youth leagues. Santiago's laugh was bitter. I thought he just didn't care. For 20 years, I believed my father knew about me and simply chose not to respond. Carlos felt something cold spreading through his chest. The letters never reached him. No, they were intercepted, filed away, handled by people whose job was to protect Diego Maradona from complications. Santiago leaned forward, and Carlos saw the careful mask slipping. Do you know what that's like, Carlos? Growing up believing your father thinks you're worth less than nothing? The weight of 30 years of guilt pressed down on Carlos like a physical thing. He thought of Maria, of how she'd looked at him with such trust and love even as he'd built their life on blood money. But at least she'd had a father. At least she'd known she was wanted. That night at the hotel, Carlos said slowly, "Your mother was going to tell him everything." She was desperate. The letters had stopped being answered, if they were ever answered at all. She'd heard rumors about his problems, the drugs, the debts. She thought maybe if she could just talk to him face to face. Santiago pulled out another photograph, this one showing Diego from that terrible night, looking haggard and paranoid in the hotel corridor. She thought she could save him, and that maybe, finally, he could save us. Carlos remembered that night with crystalline clarity. The intelligence about the cartel hit. The decision to use Diego as bait instead of simply evacuating him. The moment when everything had gone wrong and he'd been forced to choose between his mission and his conscience. The shooting started before she could reach his room, Carlos said. Before she could even knock on his door. Santiago's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We were 50 feet away when those men came out of the elevator. 50 feet from the only conversation that might have changed 3 lives. The envelope between them seemed to pulse with accumulated pain. Carlos thought of all the intelligence reports he'd filed about that night, all the careful omissions and strategic lies that had protected his career while destroying possibilities he'd never even known existed. What did he say? Santiago asked suddenly. When they put the gun to his head and demanded the money, what were those 6 words that supposedly changed everything? Carlos felt the walls of La Biela closing in around him. Those 6 words had become legend in intelligence circles, the perfect example of how the right response could diffuse an impossible situation. But sitting across from Diego's son, seeing the desperate hunger in eyes that mirrored his father's, Carlos finally understood the devastating truth. It hadn't been what Diego said that night that changed everything. It had been what he'd never been allowed to hear. "You're not here for revenge," Carlos said, his voice hollow with recognition. "You're here because you think I know something about your father that nobody else does, some secret that died with him." Santiago's careful composure finally cracked completely. "I'm here because you were the last person to have a real conversation with Diego Maradona before his world fell apart completely. And I need to know," his voice broke, "I need to know if he would have loved me." The question hung between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut through 30 years of carefully constructed lies. Carlos watched Santiago's face crumble and rebuild itself in the span of a heartbeat, revealing decades of pain that no amount of investigation or preparation could have hidden. "Santiago," Carlos began, but the young man held up a hand. "Don't." Santiago's voice was raw now, stripped of its earlier control. "Don't tell me what you think I want to hear. I've had enough lies from men in suits who think they know what's best for everyone." Carlos reached for his cortado with shaking hands, buying himself precious seconds to navigate this moment that felt like stepping onto thin ice. Around them, La Biela continued its evening rhythm, couples leaning across small tables, friends sharing wine and gossip, the comfortable sounds of a world that hadn't stopped turning despite the devastation unfolding in this corner booth. "The truth," Carlos said finally, is that I never had a real conversation with your father that night." Santiago's eyes flashed. "That's impossible. The intelligence reports, the debriefings, everyone knows you spent 40 minutes alone with him after the shooting." "I spent 40 minutes watching Diego Maradona fall apart." Carlos set down his cup, meeting Santiago's gaze directly. He was so high he could barely remember his own name, so paranoid he thought the hotel walls were listening to his thoughts. The cartel had threatened to kill his daughters if he didn't pay them $3 million, and he'd just watched 2 men die in the hallway outside his room. The color drained from Santiago's face, but the 6 words, "Tell my daughters I love them," Carlos's voice was barely audible. That's what he said when the gunman demanded the money, not some brilliant negotiation tactic, not the cunning response that saved the day. He thought he was about to die, and all he could think about was his children. Santiago stared at him, processing this information like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. That's not what the reports said. The reports said what my superiors needed them to say, that we'd successfully used Diego as an asset to identify cartel money flows, that his cooperation had led to a major bust. Carlos laughed bitterly. What they didn't say was that Diego never cooperated with anything. He was too broken to even understand what was happening. Then how? I gave them the information myself. The words tasted like ash in Carlos's mouth. I'd been tracking that particular cartel cell for 8 months. I knew their account numbers, their transfer protocols, their entire operation. But my bosses wanted a high-profile win, something that would play well in the newspapers. Santiago leaned back in his chair as if Carlos had struck him. "You used him." "We all used him. The government, the cartels, the media, everyone wanted a piece of Diego Maradona, and nobody gave a damn what it cost him." Carlos felt 30 years of suppressed guilt rising in his throat like bile. "Including me." The confession sat between them like a third presence at the table. Santiago's hands were trembling now, his careful composure completely abandoned. Carlos realized with growing horror that he was about to destroy this young man's last hope of finding meaning in his father's chaos. "But he must have said something else," Santiago pressed. "In those 40 minutes he must have—" He cried. The words came out harder than Carlos intended. He sat on the edge of that hotel bed and cried like a lost child, talking about how he'd destroyed everything he'd ever touched. His career, his marriages, his relationship with his daughters. He kept saying he was poison, that everyone who got close to him ended up hurt. Santiago's face went white. "Stop." He had a handful of letters in his suitcase, fan mail that had somehow gotten through his handlers. One was from a young mother in Colombia, talking about her son who played football and dreamed of meeting his hero. Carlos watched Santiago's expression crumble. He read it 3 times while I was there, kept saying he wished he could be the man that woman thought he was. "You're lying." But Santiago's voice carried no conviction. "He never knew about you," Carlos continued, feeling like he was performing surgery without anesthesia. But in those final years, the guilt was eating him alive. He knew there were people out there who needed him to be better than he was, and he couldn't figure out how to stop disappointing them. Santiago buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Carlos reached across the table, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. What comfort could he possibly offer? What words could undo 3 decades of stolen possibilities? "Would he have loved me?" Santiago asked through his fingers, his voice breaking on each word. Carlos thought of Diego in that hotel room, broken and desperate but still capable of such profound tenderness when he spoke about his children. The answer came easier than he'd expected. "Santiago," he said gently, "loving you would have been the one thing that might have saved him." The words settled between them like a prayer offered too late. Santiago's shoulders continued to shake, 30 years of accumulated grief finally finding its voice in the gentle evening air of La Biela. Carlos watched this man, this son, confront the devastating mathematics of missed opportunities, and felt his own carefully constructed defenses crumbling. "I killed him," Carlos said quietly, the confession emerging from some deep place he'd kept sealed since that night. Not the cartels, not the drugs, not the fame. Me. My choice to use him instead of protecting him cost your father his last chance at redemption. Santiago looked up, his face streaked with tears but his eyes suddenly sharp. "What are you talking about?" Carlos pulled out his phone, scrolled through contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in 15 years. Director Vasquez, now retired but still connected to every intelligence network in South America. His finger hovered over the call button. After that night, Diego tried to get clean. Really clean, not just for show. He spent 3 months in a clinic in Switzerland, writing letters to everyone he'd ever hurt. Carlos's voice grew stronger as the truth poured out. He had a list of people he wanted to find, to make amends to. Your mother's name was on that list. Santiago went completely still. That's impossible. He'd kept one of her letters, from 1987. He'd carried it in his wallet for 7 years without understanding why. Carlos looked at his phone screen, at the number that could confirm or destroy everything. He hired a private investigator to find her, to find you. When? 1995, 1 year after the hotel. Carlos finally pressed the call button, putting the phone on speaker as it rang. But someone leaked information about Diego's investigation to the cartels. Made them think he was cooperating with authorities, giving up names and locations. A familiar voice answered after 3 rings. "Carlos? Jesus, I thought you were dead. Director, I need you to confirm something. The Maradona file from 95. His private investigation into Colombian contacts." A pause. "Carlos, that file is still classified. My daughter is Maria Mendoza, the prosecutor investigating cartel money laundering. They've connected her to that night in 94. Carlos looked directly at Santiago. "I'm sitting with Diego's son. He deserves the truth." Another pause, longer this time. Then, the investigation was terminated after 6 months. Someone murdered the private investigator and his entire staff. Made it look like a cartel hit, but the methodology was wrong. Too clean, too professional. Santiago's face had gone ashen. "Who?" "We suspected government involvement. Someone who needed Diego to remain isolated, controllable." The director's voice carried the weight of old regrets. The day before the investigator was killed, he'd located Isabela Morales and her son in Medellin. Diego was planning to fly there the following week. Carlos ended the call and set the phone down with infinite care. Around them, the evening crowd at La Biela seemed to fade into background noise, leaving only the sound of 2 men breathing in the aftermath of revelation. "He was coming to find us," Santiago whispered. And someone made sure he never could. Carlos felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with terrible clarity. Someone who knew that a reformed Diego Maradona, reconnected with his son and motivated by love instead of fear, would be impossible to control. Santiago's grief was transforming into something harder, more focused. Who gave the order? "I don't know. But I know who carried it out." Carlos reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph that had haunted him for 30 years. Surveillance footage from outside the private investigator's office, showing a younger version of himself walking away from the building just hours before the massacre. "You." Santiago's voice was barely a whisper. "I followed orders without asking questions. Told myself I was protecting state security, maintaining operational integrity." Carlos stared at his younger self in the photograph, remembering the man who'd believed that some sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. "I killed 6 people to keep Diego Maradona from meeting his son." Santiago stood up so abruptly that his chair toppled backward. For a moment, Carlos thought the young man might attack him, might finally release 3 decades of rage and physical violence. Instead, Santiago walked to the window overlooking the cemetery, his back rigid with controlled fury. "My mother died believing he didn't want us," Santiago said to the glass. "And your father died believing he was beyond redemption." Carlos joined him at the window, looking out at the rows of marble monuments to Buenos Aires' illustrious dead. "But Santiago, the fact that he was trying to find you means something. It means that even at his lowest point, even when everyone else had given up on him, some part of Diego Maradona was still fighting to be better." Santiago turned to face him, and Carlos saw something he hadn't expected in the young man's eyes: forgiveness beginning to war with vengeance. "What happens now?" Santiago asked. Carlos looked at his phone, thinking of Maria and the danger she faced. of the photographs that had started this confrontation, of 30 years of lies that were finally demanding their price. Now, he said quietly, we finish what your father started. 2 months later, Carlos sat in the same booth at La Biela, where his carefully constructed world had finally collapsed. The evening light fell through the windows at the same angle, casting familiar shadows across worn marble tables, but everything else had changed. The man who had entered this cafe carrying 30 years of guilt was gone, replaced by someone lighter and infinitely more tired. Maria walked through the door at exactly 6 o'clock, just as she had every Tuesday since the trials ended. Her prosecutor's badge was gone. She'd resigned the day after Santiago's testimony brought down 3 government officials and exposed the intelligence network that had destroyed 2 families. But her smile remained unchanged, the same gentle warmth that had sustained Carlos through decades of lies he'd told to protect her. "How are you today, Papa?" She kissed his forehead before sliding into the opposite seat, the same question she'd asked every week since learning the truth about how her comfortable life had been purchased. "Different," he said, which had become his standard answer. Different from the man who had killed 6 people to maintain operational security. Different from the father who had built his daughter's future on blood money. Different from the intelligence officer who had followed orders without considering their human cost. Maria reached across the table and took his hand. Santiago called this morning. The foundation received another donation, enough to build 3 more schools in Medellin. Carlos nodded, unsurprised. The Diego Maradona Educational Foundation had become Santiago's obsession, his way of transforming 30 years of stolen possibilities into something that might honor both his father's memory and his mother's faith in redemption. Every week brought news of another project, another life changed by money that had once flowed through cartel accounts before Carlos had redirected it to safer channels. "He's coming to Buenos Aires next month," Maria continued. "For the anniversary. The anniversary. 3 years since Diego's death, 2 months since the truth had finally emerged. Santiago had wanted to establish some kind of memorial service, a gathering of the people whose lives had intersected with his father's chaotic journey. Carlos wasn't certain he deserved to attend, but Santiago had insisted with the quiet determination that reminded everyone why Diego's blood ran through his veins. "Will you go?" Maria asked. Carlos considered the question, watching through the window as evening pedestrians hurried past the cemetery across the street. Somewhere in that landscape of marble monuments, Diego Maradona rested beneath flowers that Santiago replaced every month, carrying on conversations with a father who could finally hear him. "I think I have to," Carlos said finally. They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter navigating the strange territory of a relationship rebuilt on truth instead of protection. Maria had forgiven him with a grace that left Carlos humbled, not for the lies, which she understood, but for believing she wasn't strong enough to handle reality. The prosecutor in her had always been capable of facing darkness. It was the father in him who had been too afraid to trust her strength. "Do you ever wonder," Maria asked quietly, "what would have happened if you had refused the order? If you had let Diego find Santiago back then?" The question that haunted Carlos every morning when he woke up in his smaller apartment, every evening when he counted the cost of choices made in service to masters whose names he'd never learned. Sometimes he could almost see it. An alternate timeline where Diego Maradona found his son in time, where love proved stronger than addiction, where redemption arrived before it was too late. "I think," Carlos said slowly, "that Diego would have died anyway. The cartels, the drugs, the pressure, it was all too much for one man to carry. But Santiago would have had a father's love instead of a father's absence, and Diego would have died knowing he was more than his mistakes. And you?" Maria pressed gently. Carlos smiled, feeling something like peace settle in his chest. "I would have remained the man who followed orders without question. Santiago would never have investigated his father's death, never uncovered the intelligence network, never found the courage to demand justice." He squeezed his daughter's hand. "Sometimes the worst thing we do becomes the path to the best thing we become." The waiter approached with their usual order, 2 cortados and a plate of medialunas that neither of them would finish. Carlos watched the young man's efficient movements and remembered being that certain of his place in the world, that convinced of the righteousness of his actions. As the sun set behind the cemetery, Carlos felt the weight of his phone in his pocket. Santiago's latest message remained unanswered, a photograph of children playing football in a schoolyard in Medellin, their faces bright with the kind of hope that Carlos had spent 30 years believing was too dangerous to protect. Tomorrow he would respond. Tomorrow he would confirm his attendance at the anniversary gathering. Tomorrow he would continue the slow work of earning forgiveness he didn't deserve. Tonight, he would sit with his daughter in the place where truth had finally demanded its price, and feel grateful for the terrible grace of consequences that led home.